The natural urge towards sensual enjoyment, manifested in delight in food and drink and sexual pleasure, is the echo and mirror of man's strongest natural forces of self-preservation. The basic forms of enjoyment correspond to these most primordial forces of being, which tend to preserve the individual man as well as the whole race, in the existence for which he was created. But for the very reason that these forces are closely allied to the deepest human urge toward being, they exceed all other powers of mankind in their destructive violence once they degenerate into selfishness. That passage comes from Josef Pieper's work, The Four Cardinal Virtues, and in particular a chapter on temperance, one of the four cardinal virtues or key abilities that enable us to live a good life. In it, he argues that our most basic desires, specifically for nourishment and for sexual fulfillment, are rooted in our deepest desires for survival, both as individuals and as a society. However, because these forces are so powerful, they can easily go awry and begin to dominate our lives. Because of this, Pieper argues that temperance is critical to living our lives well. But is this true? And what does Pieper really mean by all of this? To really get to the bottom of those questions, first we'll really need to understand the answer to these three questions. First, what is the danger of intemperance? Second, what causes intemperance? And third, what is inner order? In his exploration of temperance, Pieper notes that today we often reduce temperance to moderation in food and drink. Further, for many people it has a negative connotation associated with shame and repression, considering it a restriction on our personal freedom. Indeed, historically in the US, the temperance movement promoted total rejection of all alcohol and was deeply involved in the short-lived Prohibition-era ban. Pieper would likely not support such an extreme approach, but would also disagree with the totally negative view of temperance, arguing that true temperance is good and that any negative feelings for it are actually rooted in a deep misunderstanding. Indeed, for Pieper, giving up on temperance means giving in to all our desires without any self-control. But clearly doing so would result in living like an animal, constantly following our instincts for immediate pleasure. And while it's good for an animal to act like an animal, for Pieper, humans should act human. That is to say, they should act rationally. I'm sure we can all think of examples of the danger of giving in to all of our desires without any thought of the consequences. From sports gambling, to addiction to plastic surgery, to even just spending hours doom scrolling every day on TikTok or Instagram, there's simply no shortage of dark paths presented to us. Interestingly, Pieper argues that what is often going on under the surface when we give in to our desires without any thought is an attempt to escape into a fantasy, which in turn comes from a fundamental incapacity to live with ourselves. Further, to go down the road of intemperance instead of developing real, nourishing human relationships is to end up in a vicious cycle where we find ourselves unhappy, which leads us to despair, which makes it harder to make good choices, which makes us more unhappy, and on and on. As Pieper explains, it may be the sign of complete rootlessness. It may mean that man has lost his capacity for living with himself, that, in flight from himself, nauseated and bored by the void of an interior life, gutted by despair, he is seeking with selfish anxiety and on 1,000 futile paths that which is given only to the noble stillness of a heart held ready for sacrifice and thus in possession of itself, namely, the fullness of being. In short, to be intemperate is to give in to the self-destructive forces of ourselves and of the world, and it is a path to ruin that is at both once far too short and far too long. But this in turn raises another question. Why are these forces so powerful and self-destructive? Well, the short answer is that these are our abilities to survive. They are, in a certain sense, the most basic levels of our life force. In particular, there are two key powers: nourishment, aka eating and drinking, which enables us to preserve ourselves, and sexuality, which preserves society. Of course, those are the two same forces that are the most self-destructive if they are not used properly. Further, Pieper points out that, ironically, people who become obsessed with those goods risk self-destruction because of how quickly our desires for these things can become overstimulated and grow too powerful to control. As Pieper writes, the more necessary something is, the more the order of reason must be preserved in it. In other words, intemperance is somehow both selfish and self-destructive, and occurs when we degrade ourselves and make ourselves slaves of our own abilities, which are actually intended to preserve us. The human person possesses the power for both self-preservation and self-destruction, and this is an essential part of being human. Okay, so we see the clear need to have reason guide our desires, especially when they can be so powerful. This is where true temperance comes in. As Pieper explains, The discipline of temperance, understood as selfless self-preservation, is the saving and defending realization of the inner order of man. The discipline of temperance defends him against all selfish perversion of the inner order, through which alone the moral person exists and lives effectively. In other words, while temperance is rooted in the disciplining of the instinctive craving for pleasure, especially those that concern our self-preservation, it is ultimately so much more than that. Temperance is the virtue by which we order or organize how we treat ourselves. As Pieper writes, "To the virtue of temperance, as the preserving and defending realization of man's inner order, the gift of beauty is particularly coordinated. Not only is temperance beautiful in itself, it also renders men beautiful. Beauty, however, must be understood in its original meaning, as the glow of the true and the good irradiating from every ordered state of being, and not in the patent significance of immediate sensual appeal. The beauty of temperance has a more spiritual, more austere, more virile aspect. It is of the essence of this beauty that it does not conflict with true virility, but rather has an affinity to it. Temperance, as the wellspring and premise of fortitude, is the virtue of mature manliness." Indeed, in Greek, the word for temperance is actually sophrosone, which could literally be translated as sound mind or safe heart. While moderation is a good rule of thumb, temperance at its fullness is when a person's entire inner life is ordered. Their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions are all in the right place. Pieper drives this point home, writing, "Aquinas says that the second meaning of temperance is serenity of the spirit. It is obvious that this proposition does not imply a purely subjective state of mental calm or the tranquil satisfaction which is the byproduct of an unassuming, leisurely life in a narrow circle. Nor does it mean a mere absence of irritation or dispassionate equanimity. All this need not go deeper than the surface of the intellectual and spiritual life. What is meant is the serenity that fills the inmost recesses of the human being and is the seal and fruit of order. The purpose and goal of temperantia is man's inner order, from which alone this serenity of spirit can flow forth. Temperance signifies the realizing of this order within oneself. Indeed, temperance isn't about being a robot that rejects any physical pleasure. Rather, the tempered person knows how to engage in physical pleasures in moderation, and beyond that is actually able to regulate their entire inner life. A tempered person knows how to be joyful at a wedding and sorrowful at a funeral. Temperance lets us order everything in our inner life in perfect harmony. Sounds good to me. Okay, so I hope by now we have a pretty good idea of what temperance is and why Pieper thinks it's critical to living a good life. We saw that first, the dangers of intemperance is self-destruction by way of misusing our powers of self-preservation. Second, we saw that intemperance is often caused by the doomed attempt to escape our lives. Third, and finally, we saw that temperance begins by bringing order to these powers of self-preservation, but ultimately culminates in the ability to order our entire inner lives. In a certain sense, temperance is the full unfolding or proper growth of the entire human person. Rather than being cruel or repressive, temperance is both liberating and purifying. Not too bad. For those who have made it to this point in the video, thanks again for sticking around. If you're interested in taking a closer look at the book I used to research this video, I'll put a link below. In an upcoming video, I'll explore in more detail exactly how to get back on track if we are indeed living an intemperate life. Until next time, friends.